nation is polarized. When I hear our leaders talking, their solutions to our national problems are diametrically opposed. I'm listening for a new voice for the future. Does that sound like I'm describing the current state of affairs in the United States? Well, I'm not. I'm actually voicing the concerns of the people in the crowd listening to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. The people are asking, how are we supposed to live as faithful Jews when the soldiers of the Roman Empire occupy our country? Unlike in the United States, there's no separation of church and state in first century Israel. Politics and religion go hand in hand. So factions within first century Judaism answer the people's questions in very different ways. The Zealots are a political movement, inciting Jews to take up arms, start a revolution, and overthrow the Romans. The Sadducees are the party of the wealthy, the aristocrats, the high priests. They're willing to compromise and collaborate with the Romans in order to defend the status quo and maintain their favored position. The Pharisees are scholars who recognize that Israel is no match for the Roman Empire, so they encourage people to turn inward, to practice their faith in isolation, to meticulously follow the law of Moses so as to keep Jewish identity alive. What is Israel to do? It's in the middle of this political and religious fray that Jesus begins his public ministry. In Matthew's account, Jesus has just called his first disciples and has been going throughout Galilee, teaching in the synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among the people. News about him is spreading. Large crowds from Galilee, Jerusalem, Judea, and elsewhere are following him. Jesus' answer to the people's question is far different from the answer of the Zealots, the Sadducees, or the Pharisees. For them, the reign of God is a future hope. But for Jesus, the reign of God is a present reality. Jesus is preaching one of his most important sermons about the kingdom of God and about how to live as his disciples in the world. He isn't pulling any punches. He tells the crowd up front that they may face insults and persecution for following him. But the reign of God happens not only through what Jesus does, but through what the disciples will do as a community of faith. Jesus tells the crowd that disciples have certain characteristics and certain responsibilities. First, disciples are the salt of the earth, and they are to retain their saltiness. Salt is a seasoning, but it can lose its saltiness if it's polluted by other chemicals. Jesus' disciples are supposed to be salty and model Jesus' approach to the world. He warns them against being corrupted by the world and losing their distinctive identity as his followers. The church, the Jesus movement, is a community that doesn't conform to the world, but works to transform the world. Second, disciples are the light of the world and must shine their light before others. In this morning's reading from Isaiah, God speaks through the prophet to tell the people that their light shall break forth like the dawn, and their light shall rise in the darkness, if they feed the hungry, house the homeless, clothe the naked, and loose the bonds of injustice. As a community of disciples, we are to bring light to the dark places where people live. And when we do, the reign of God happens. For example, the reign of God is made visible to the world when we serve our community by educating and caring for the young children in our Episcopal day school. When children at Frontier School of Innovation take backpacks home with food for the weekend. And when families at Kansas City Hospice House enjoy the meals that we prepare. The reign of God is made visible to the world when the clients of Shelter KC have warm hats and gloves and scarves and backpacks for their worldly possessions. When our hungry neighbors served by the Red Ridge Food Pantry receive our Pantry Sunday donations. And when the guests at Nourish KC's Kansas City Community Kitchen receive fresh food from our orchard. Third, disciples are doers of God deeds. By our actions, we show the world what the reign of God is like. When our faith community acts in love, service, inclusiveness, justice, and forgiveness, we act not to bring praise to ourselves, but so onlookers will give praise to God, in whose name we act. Israel's question and Jesus' answer is relevant, not only to the first century. In today's tense times when we are pulled apart by competing visions of what our future as a church and as a country should be, Israel's question becomes our question. How are we supposed to live as faithful Christians in the modern world? I'm listening for an answer, and I hear Jesus speak to his disciples. Not as a bunch of individuals who believe the same thing, but as a community of faith. I hear Jesus speak to St. Peter and all saints. Be salty. Shine your light in dark places, and be doers of the word of God.